I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, listening for sounds that should not be there. What happened to my father and me 3 years ago changed everything. I know it sounds impossible. I would not believe it myself if someone else told me the story. My dad and I used to go camping every summer at different locations around the state. That year, we chose Echo Valley Campground, a remote site nestled between two mountain ridges about 4 hours from home. The online reviews mentioned its pristine hiking trails and crystal clear lake. What they did not mention was how isolated it really was. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late August. The heat was intense, but the shade of the towering pine trees offered relief. The campground host, an elderly man with weathered hands, checked us in and mentioned we might be the only campers for the next 2 nights. Most families had already headed home before school started, he explained. The first day was everything we hoped for. We set up our tent near the lake shore, spent the afternoon swimming and fishing, and caught enough trout for dinner. As evening approached, we built a fire and cooked our catch. The sunset painted the mountains orange and red. Everything felt perfect. That night, we slept soundly to the gentle lapping of water against the shore. I remember thinking this might be our best camping trip yet. The second day started the same way. We hiked a trail that wound up the eastern ridge, stopping to rest at a lookout point that offered a view of the entire valley below. Our campsite looked tiny from up there, a small orange dot surrounded by endless forest. During lunch, my dad pointed out how quiet everything had become. No birds singing, no insects buzzing. Even the wind had stopped. The silence felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. But the sky remained clear. We spent the afternoon by the lake, but neither of us felt like swimming. The water, which had been inviting the day before, now looked dark and unwelcoming. Shadows seemed to move beneath the surface, though we knew it was just our imagination. As we prepared dinner, my dad kept glancing toward the tree line. When I asked what was wrong, he shrugged and said he felt like we were being watched. I laughed it off, but I had been feeling the same thing. The sun disappeared behind the western ridge earlier than expected, plunging our campsite into premature twilight. We built up the fire bigger than necessary, neither of us willing to admit we felt nervous. Around 8:30, we heard the first sound. It came from across the lake, a long, low whistle that echoed off the mountain walls. We stopped talking and listened, but it did not repeat. My dad suggested it might be wind passing through rock formations. That made sense, so we continued our conversation about baseball and school starting soon. Normal father and son topics that felt reassuring. The second whistle came 20 minutes later, closer this time. It seemed to originate from the forest behind our tent. The sound lasted longer with an odd warbling quality that made my skin crawl. We both stood up from our camp chairs, scanning the darkness beyond our firelight. Our flashlights revealed nothing but tree trunks and undergrowth. No movement, no glowing eyes, just empty forest. The third whistle was different. It started the same way, but then changed into something else entirely. Something that sounded almost like words, though in no language either of us recognized. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions at once, surrounding our campsite. My father grabbed the camp hatchet we used for splitting kindling. His hands were shaking. Mine were too. That's when we heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps circling our camp just beyond the reach of our firelight. Whatever was making them was big, much bigger than a person. The steps would pause for long moments, and during those silences, we could hear breathing, deep, slow breaths that did not sound human. The rhythm was wrong. Too long between inhale and exhale. My dad whispered that we should get in the car and leave. I nodded, but as we turned toward the parking area, the footsteps moved to block our path. We were being herded back toward the tent. The fire suddenly dimmed, though neither of us had touched it. The flames shrank down to barely more than glowing embers, leaving us in near darkness. Our flashlights flickered and went out one by one despite having fresh batteries. That's when we saw it. Not clearly, but enough. A shape between the trees. Tall and wrong somehow. It moved without making sound now, gliding rather than walking. When it turned toward us, I saw what might have been eyes reflecting our dying firelight. Too many eyes, in the wrong places. We ran for the tent and zipped ourselves inside. My dad held the hatchet while I clutched my phone, trying to call for help. No signal. The screen showed the time as 9:47 p.m., then went completely black. For the next few hours, the thing circled our tent. We could hear it moving just outside the thin nylon walls. Sometimes it would stop directly beside where one of us was lying, and we could hear that strange breathing. Other times, it would scrape something against the tent fabric. Long, slow scrapes that went from top to bottom. Neither of us spoke. We barely breathed. Any sound might draw its attention. Around what should have been midnight, everything stopped. The breathing ceased. The footsteps ended. Even the normal night sounds of the forest remained absent. We waited in that terrible silence until exhaustion overtook fear. I remember my dad still gripping the hatchet as his eyes finally closed. I woke to bright sunlight streaming through the tent walls. My phone showed 11:23 a.m., though it had been dead for hours. My dad's phone was working too, fully charged despite dying the night before. Outside, everything looked normal. Our campfire had burned down to cold ashes. The lake sparkled blue in the morning sun. Birds sang in the trees. All evidence of the previous night had vanished, except for one thing. Around our tent, pressed deep into the soft earth, were tracks. They looked almost human, but too large and with too many toes. The stride length suggested something over 8 feet tall. We packed in record time and drove home without speaking about what happened. When we finally talked, we discovered we both remembered the same details: the whistles, the breathing, the shape between the trees. We never went back to Echo Valley. In fact, we have not been camping anywhere since. Sometimes I search online for similar stories, hoping to find others who experienced something like we did. So far, I have found nothing. My dad refuses to discuss it now. He says some things are better left buried, but I still think about those tracks around our tent and wonder what would have happened if we had not stayed inside. 3 years later, I still sleep with a light on. Even after she admitted she had lied, the damage was done. People still whispered when I walked into the grocery store. My own neighbors avoided eye contact. I lost 3 clients from my freelance business, and my reputation felt ruined beyond repair. I needed to get away from it all. I had always found peace in the wilderness, so I decided to take a long weekend camping trip to the Adirondacks in upstate New York. The forecast called for clear skies and cool temperatures, perfect for a solo retreat. I chose a remote spot near a small lake that required a 2-mile hike from the nearest parking area. I figured the distance would keep most casual campers away, and I would have the solitude I desperately needed. The hike in was beautiful. October had painted the maple and oak trees in brilliant reds and golds. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the earthy smell of fallen leaves. For the first time in months, I felt my shoulders relax and my breathing slow down. I found the perfect campsite about 50 yards from the lakeshore, nestled among towering white pines. The ground was level and covered with a thick carpet of pine needles that would make a comfortable sleeping surface. I set up my tent facing the water and gathered enough firewood to last through the evening. As the sun began to set, I started a small fire and heated up a can of chili on my camp stove. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the lake and the soft whisper of wind through the pine boughs above me. I pulled out my paperback thriller and settled into my camp chair to read by the firelight. This was exactly what I needed. No angry phone calls, no judgmental stares, no stress. Just me, the fire, and a good book. About an hour after dark, my phone buzzed with a text message. I was surprised to have any signal out here, but I figured it was probably my brother checking in on me. We had talked about my plans before I left. The message was from an unknown number with a 518 area code. I recognized it as a local area code from back home. The message simply said, "Nice fire you have going there." I looked around instinctively, but saw nothing beyond the small circle of light cast by my campfire. The darkness beyond seemed impenetrable. I assumed it was a wrong number, maybe someone playing a prank, so I ignored it and went back to my book. 10 minutes later, another message arrived from the same number. "I can see you reading. What book is it?" This time my heart rate picked up noticeably. I stood up and walked to the edge of my campfire's light, straining to see into the darkness. The forest was completely silent, except for my own breathing. which seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. I typed back, "Who is this? How can you see me?" The response came immediately. "You picked a good spot. Very secluded." Now I was genuinely scared. Someone was out there watching me and they had my phone number. I walked back to my tent and retrieved the large hunting knife I always brought camping. It was not much against a potential threat, but it made me feel slightly more secure. I sent another text. "If you do not stop messaging me, I am calling the police." Their reply made my blood run cold. "No signal out here for phone calls. I already checked." They were right. I tried to call 911 and got the "no service" message, even though I could still send and receive texts. I realized I was completely cut off from any help. I added more wood to the fire, making it burn brighter and extend the circle of light around my campsite. Then I sat back down in my chair, but this time facing outward toward the forest, gripping my knife in my right hand. For the next hour, no more messages came. I began to hope that whoever it was had given up and moved on. Maybe they were just trying to scare me, and when they realized I was not going to engage further, they lost interest. I was wrong. At exactly 11:30, according to my phone, I heard the unmistakable sound of a stick breaking somewhere in the darkness to my left. I spun toward the sound, but saw nothing. My fire had burned down to mostly coals by then, and the light it provided was much dimmer. Another stick snapped, this time from a different direction. Then another. Someone was definitely out there, moving around my campsite in a wide circle. I stood up and called out into the darkness. "I know you are out there. What do you want?" Silence for a long moment. Then my phone buzzed again. "I want you to know how it feels to be watched, to be hunted, to have nowhere to run." The messages were getting more threatening, and I realized this was not random. Someone had followed me here deliberately. Someone who knew about my situation back home and wanted to make me suffer. I quickly broke down my campsite in the dim light of the dying fire, stuffing everything into my backpack as fast as I could. I was not going to sit there and wait to see what this person had planned. As I shouldered my pack and started toward the trail back to my car, my phone lit up with another message. "Running away again? Just like you did from your wife." That confirmed my worst fear. This was someone from my town who knew about my divorce and the rumors that had spread. But I could not figure out who would go this far to torment me. I switched on my headlamp and started jogging down the trail as fast as I dared in the darkness. Behind me, I could hear footsteps crashing through the underbrush, not bothering to be quiet anymore. I ran harder, my backpack bouncing awkwardly and my breathing becoming labored. The footsteps behind me seemed to be getting closer. Panic was setting in, and I stumbled over a root, going down hard on my hands and knees. As I scrambled back to my feet, my headlamp illuminated a figure, standing about 20 feet behind me on the trail. It was a man in dark clothing with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. I could not make out his features, but something about his build seemed familiar. "Stay away from me," I shouted, pulling out my knife and holding it in front of me. The figure took a step closer, and I could see he was holding something in his hand. It looked like a phone, and suddenly it flashed as he took a picture of me. "Perfect," he said in a voice I now recognized. It was Tom Morrison, a guy I had known in high school who lived 2 streets over from me. We had never been friends, but we had never been enemies either. I could not understand why he would be doing this. "Tom? What the hell is wrong with you? Why are you doing this?" He laughed, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. "Because you think you are better than everyone else. You think you can just leave town and start over somewhere else, like nothing ever happened." "I never did anything to you," I said, backing slowly down the trail while keeping the knife pointed toward him. "You did not have to. People like you always land on your feet. You will find some new place where nobody knows about your past, and you will start over. Meanwhile, the rest of us are stuck dealing with the mess you left behind." I had no idea what he was talking about, but I was not going to stand there and argue with someone who had clearly lost touch with reality. I turned and ran again, this time not looking back. I could hear him pursuing me, but he was not as fast as I was, and the adrenaline was giving me strength. After what felt like forever, I finally saw my car in the parking area ahead. I threw my gear into the back and jumped into the driver's seat, locking the doors immediately. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the key into the ignition. As the engine started, Tom emerged from the tree line still carrying his phone. I threw the car in reverse and backed out quickly, then shifted into drive and accelerated down the dirt road as fast as I dared. In my rearview mirror, I could see Tom standing in the parking area, getting smaller and smaller as I drove away. I drove straight home without stopping, checking my mirrors constantly to make sure I was not being followed. I never received another threatening text, and I never saw Tom Morrison again, though I heard through mutual acquaintances that he moved away from our town a few months later. I never went back to that camping spot, and I have never gone on another solo camping trip since then. The wilderness no longer feels like a safe refuge to me. It feels like a place where people can disappear, where help is too far away, and where the darkness can hide things that should not be there. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had not been able to reach my car that night. Would Tom have just continued to terrorize me, or did he have something worse planned? I suppose I will never know, but I am grateful that I will never have to find out. Every summer since I could remember, our extended family would gather at my grandfather's cabin in the Adirondacks for what we called Pine Ridge Week. The cabin sat on 15 acres of dense woodland, surrounded by nothing but trees and wildlife for miles in every direction. My grandfather had built the cabin himself back in the 70s. It was a massive log structure with 6 bedrooms and a wraparound porch that overlooked a small creek. The place could easily house our entire clan of 12 people when everyone showed up together. That particular summer, I was 14 years old. My younger brother Marcus was 11, and our cousins David and Sam were 12 and 10 respectively. The 4 of us had grown up together during these annual trips, and we considered ourselves the adventurous ones of the family. My grandfather was a retired park ranger who knew these woods like the back of his weathered hands. He had spent decades hiking every trail and marking every landmark within a 20-mile radius. Part of his property included an old-growth section, where some of the pine trees were over 100 years old. During dinner on our 3rd night there, the conversation turned to camping. My grandfather mentioned that when he was younger, he used to take groups on overnight camping expeditions, deeper into the forest. My father and uncle started sharing their own camping stories from when they were kids. That gave us the idea. We asked if we could camp out in the woods that night, just the 4 of us. At first, our parents were hesitant. Our mothers especially voiced concerns about us being alone in the wilderness overnight. But my grandfather supported the idea. He said it would be good for us to experience the forest at night, to learn self-reliance and respect for nature. He promised to set us up in a spot he knew well, not too far from the cabin. After some debate, our parents agreed. My grandfather and father would escort us to the campsite and help us get established before leaving us on our own. Our mothers made us promise to stay together and come back immediately if anything felt wrong. Around 6 in the evening, my grandfather led us about half a mile into the woods. He chose a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, where he said he had camped many times before. The ground was covered with a thick carpet of pine needles that would provide natural cushioning. My father and grandfather helped us set up our 4-person tent and arrange our sleeping bags inside. We gathered firewood and built a small fire pit using stones from the nearby creek. They showed us how to properly maintain the fire and stressed the importance of completely extinguishing it before going to sleep. Before they left, my grandfather pointed out several landmarks we could use to find our way back to the cabin if needed. He also gave us a whistle to blow 3 times if we encountered any serious problems. The adults would be listening for it. After they departed, the 4 of us settled around our campfire as darkness began to fall. The forest came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. Owls hooted in the distance, and we could hear small animals rustling through the underbrush. Marcus had brought a deck of playing cards, so we passed the time with several rounds of poker using pine cones as chips. The crackling fire provided warmth and light, creating a cozy atmosphere, despite being surrounded by the vast wilderness. For the first hour or so, everything was perfect. We told stories, shared snacks, and enjoyed the unique experience of being on our own in the woods. The fire cast dancing shadows on the trees around us, and the night sky was brilliantly clear, with more stars than we ever saw back home. Then we heard the first sound. It was a low, guttural noise that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the circle of our firelight. We all stopped talking and listened intently, but the sound did not repeat. David suggested it was probably just a deer or some other harmless animal moving through the woods. We resumed our card game, but the mood had shifted slightly. We found ourselves glancing frequently into the darkness beyond our small camp, straining to see or hear anything unusual. About 20 minutes later, we heard it again. This time it was louder and seemed closer. The sound was difficult to describe, somewhere between a growl and a moan, unlike anything I had ever heard before. Sam, who was the youngest, asked if we should blow the whistle and call for help, but the rest of us convinced him that it was probably nothing to worry about. We were trying to be brave and prove we could handle ourselves in the wilderness. We decided to let the fire burn down and get ready for sleep. We carefully extinguished the flames and climbed into our tent, zipping it closed behind us. Each of us had a small flashlight, which provided enough light to see inside our temporary shelter. And lying in our sleeping bags, we continued to whisper and joke around, though I could tell everyone was more on edge than they wanted to admit. The complete darkness outside the tent made every small sound seem amplified and potentially threatening. That's when we heard the breathing. It was heavy and deliberate, clearly coming from something large just outside our tent. We all froze, hardly daring to breathe ourselves. The breathing continued for what felt like several minutes, slowly circling our campsite. Marcus grabbed my arm so tightly it hurt. I could hear Sam's teeth chattering, though whether from cold or fear I could not tell. David whispered that we should stay completely still and wait for whatever it was to leave, but it did not leave. Instead, the breathing sounds grew closer, and we could hear heavy footsteps moving around the perimeter of our tent. Something was definitely out there, and it was big. Then came the sniffing sounds, like a large animal investigating our scent. We could hear it right against the fabric of the tent wall, so close that the material actually moved slightly from its breath. That's when the tent started shaking. At first, it was just a gentle movement, as if something was brushing against the outside. But then it became more violent, like something was deliberately trying to collapse our shelter or get inside. All four of us started screaming at the same time. I fumbled for the tent zipper, while the others shouted for help. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the zipper, but I finally managed to get it open. We tumbled out of the tent one after another, our flashlights creating wild beams of light as we stumbled through the darkness. I could hear something crashing through the underbrush behind us, but I did not dare look back. We ran toward the cabin as fast as we could, following the path my grandfather had shown us earlier. Branches scratched our faces and arms as we pushed through the woods, but we did not slow down until we could see the lights of the cabin ahead. Our entire family was already on the porch, waiting for us. They had heard our screams echoing through the forest and were preparing to come looking for us. We collapsed on the porch steps, gasping for breath and trying to explain what had happened. My grandfather and father immediately grabbed flashlights and headed back toward our campsite to investigate. They were gone for over an hour, and when they returned, they looked puzzled and concerned. They had found our tent still standing but slightly askew, as if something had indeed been pushing against it. Our sleeping bags and gear were scattered around, but there were no clear footprints or other evidence of what might have caused the disturbance. My grandfather said he had never experienced anything like it in all his years in those woods. He examined the area carefully, but could not determine what kind of animal might have been responsible for frightening us. The next morning, we all went back to retrieve our camping equipment. In the daylight, the campsite looked peaceful and ordinary. There were some broken branches nearby and areas where the pine needles appeared disturbed, but nothing that provided any clear answers. We never went camping in those woods again during our annual visits. In fact, none of us ever ventured very far from the cabin after dark for the rest of that week. The experience had shaken all of us more than we cared to admit. Years later, I still wonder what we encountered that night in the Pine Ridge Forest. My grandfather passed away when I was in college, taking his knowledge of those woods with him. Whatever was out there that night remains a mystery that I think about whenever I find myself in the wilderness after dark.